dear audience. The Queen is dead. Long live King who? William V, Charles III, Jacob I? Hadn't it been until recently that the seemingly eternal monarch Lilibet, to whom we got used to and who seemed to represent all that we related to the good old days? The times, they are out of joint, it seems, but they also help us towards gaining a new perspective on our present. In the previous days, it occurred to me that we, as Germans, seem to be strongly connected to the English, more than we would actually like to admit. Just 1 week ago, the British people buried their Queen, Elizabeth II. The whole world, at least some billions of them, seemed to be glued to their TV screens, watching the pompous ritual in London and Windsor. And even the two main public broadcasters in Germany, ARD and ZDF, couldn't help but broadcast this very ceremony at the same time, identical pictures provided by the BBC. And yes, we Germans, we liked it, didn't we? She belongs to us. She could have been an aunt of ours, many of us would probably say. Surprisingly enough, this feeling of belonging or family membership also applies to another great Englishman. Many Germans consider William Shakespeare, the so-called bard from Stratford-upon-Avon, as one of their classical poets, and even alongside Goethe and Schiller. And it is Shakespeare's plays that are most frequently performed plays on German stages. We Germans, we love his plays, and especially his tragedies. The blondier they are, the better for us. So, what is it that fascinates us about William Shakespeare again and again? The discussion about Shakespeare has been going on since he worked as a playwright in London. A discussion about a writer who died more than 400 years ago, who lived in an age called the English Renaissance, and whose language was early modern English. In my talk, I am going to deal with the question whether Shakespeare should be taught at school or not. I shall briefly focus on Shakespeare as a man of his times, and on his works, particularly on his plays, to prove my point of view that Shakespeare is worth dealing with. But can Shakespeare be taught, like algebra or Latin? Well, if I ask you, dear students, why you personally bother with Shakespeare, your answer would probably be, well, I've gotta do it for school. I don't want to get bad marks, or some more sophisticated students even might say quite vaguely, oh yes, I want to improve my knowledge. And you can learn a lot about history and literature and stuff like that. But the point about it is that most students do it because it is on the curriculum, because they are expected to do it, and not because they are motivated themselves. They are not curious. But is it curiosity and emotions that are prerequisites for successful and sustainable learning? That's why today's question cannot any longer be to teach Shakespeare or not to teach him. Rather, it ought to be, should students be given the opportunity to encounter Shakespeare, to help them find their individual approach to him, to help them find their very personal Shakespeare. This approach, by the way, is called the script approach. It has been suggested by experts like Rex Gibson, who encourage teachers and students to encounter Shakespeare's text as scripts that are not finished yet. Well, only when practicing and while staging the script, Gibson says students will be able to find their own individual access to the 400-year-old texts and decipher some of the messages Shakespeare has for them. Please remember these questions and ideas at the end of my talk, when you are going to discuss this matter in class. So, with our hearts and minds open, let's discover the universe of Shakespeare now. First, there is the man, whose life students like you and me might find interesting and which can increase students' curiosity. Shakespeare was our age, 18 when he married a woman who was 8 years older than him. He had to, because she was pregnant. In quick succession, he made her 3 children and off he went, to disappear for about 7 years, the so-called lost years. Much later, when he had retired and returned to his wife, he left her only his second-best bed in his will. That gives a deep insight, doesn't it? In London, where he worked as an actor, playwright and theatre director, he soon was successful, but he also had to face hostility, envy and slander. Competition among the theatres was high, but Shakespeare prevailed. He even managed to be shareholder in 2 of London's theatres, the Globe and the Blackfriars, the latter even having a roof. A shrewd businessman as he was, he purchased a big estate in his hometown, Stratford, to retire there. He was a man of his time, and he made the best use of it. Whenever students like us are given the opportunity to find certain parallels between our lives and Shakespeare's, we will appreciate and be keen to learn more. Shakespeare lived in the reign of Elizabeth I. This era is often referred to as the Elizabethan age, and some of you might even feel reminded of the era of Elizabeth II, which ended on the 8th of September. Shakespeare's England had defeated the Spanish Armada. The country thrived and prospered in many respects. England was an economic power, a naval power, a respectable nation under Elizabeth. The arts blossomed too. For us today, it is hard to imagine that in the afternoon people from all walks of life dropped their tools, stopped their activities, to rush into the theatres as soon as a play had been announced. People were keen to see what their playwrights had written for them, and everybody could afford regular visits to the theatre. The poor people had to pay 1 penny only. The young and the old, the rich and the poor, men and women, they all gathered in the theatre. The local authorities did not approve of that business. That's why the theaters were located outside town's jurisdiction. When the audience did not like the play, it had to be rewritten. No problem for the playwrights at that time. People loved to be entertained. They loved to be made cry, to suffer with the characters on stage, and to be informed. They got what they wanted, they got what they needed, and the plays were performed only a couple of times, to be replaced soon by a new play. Well, isn't that something we would like to have nowadays too? Something we ought to get back, because it is important to us too, to see all the world on stage, to maybe find ourselves in a play. When Elizabeth I died, an era came to its end. Elizabeth had not settled the question of her succession, and so Shakespeare and his contemporaries lived in great anxiety. Who would be the next king? Would the nation fall apart? Would usurpation become a legitimate political means? How could one make ends meet? Shakespeare asked many of these questions in his plays, and he offered different answers and different perspectives. Students who are given a personal approach to Shakespeare will find out soon that today's England is facing similar challenges. The Queen is dead, and with her an age, the promise of hope, of continuity, of stability and tradition has been buried too. Well, it is only certain that Charles III will be inaugurated soon, but what about the rest? Will Scotland leave the Union and join the EU? But, survival of the EU is in question too. But how about Northern Ireland? Will it reunite with Ireland? And isn't the nation, as much as other European countries, facing massive economic decline and poverty too? Who and what can still be trusted in? Shakespeare, or at least his concerns, they still seem to be alive. At this point, it is time to have a closer look at Shakespeare's play, as I have been trying to suggest various and timeless political questions like leadership, the abuse of power, tyranny and political stability are dealt with in Shakespeare's plays, particularly in his histories, in his plays and the ones of the so-called dark period. Yet there are many more topics that might appeal to students who are experiencing their own Shakespeare instead of being taught England's greatest playwright or whatever. Well, just to mention a few: love and hate, friendship, generation conflicts, lies and deception, rivalry, foolishness and greed, power and powerlessness, pretense and real being, ambition, conscience, guilt and atonement, self-knowledge and the importance of honor. As you can see, these are timeless topics that I can tell you are delivered through a brilliant language, a language that is full of imagery, a language that can be both coarse and sophisticated, and has many entertaining elements to appeal to the audience. There is a parallel action sometimes, or even a play within a play. Admittedly, dear students, early, middle, English is not easy to understand, but students can encounter Shakespeare's texts in two ways. They can be given lots of annotations on the one hand, and get the idea of the original text, and they can work with texts that are adapted to their level of English, and on the other hand. However, they should not be expected to analyze Shakespeare's language in a scholarly way, as they might have experienced in their German classes. Rather, they should try to feel it and use their own imagination. But what is it that makes Shakespeare's play unique? Well, I think we, as explorers of Shakespeare's universe, feel being addressed personally. That is because Shakespeare again and again deals with the question, what is man like, and how can he cope with himself and the world? Or what are the conflicts that exist in man? Shakespeare's characters cannot be divided into the goodies and the baddies. Instead, you get the idea that there are many real characters, sometimes like you and me, and sometimes there's also the nasty guy in the neighborhood. They have their faults, they have their deficiencies, and often the part of the victim and the perpetrator can be found in one person. Isn't that amazing? Othello loses his love because he falls victim to lies and deception. If only he had been faithful to his wife and had banished suspicion from his heart. Don't we know similar stories from our everyday life? Hamlet returns home, finding pretense, corruption, and even murder in his own family. His time is out of joint, and so is ours, in this first decade of the 21st century. Can you tell me how to deal with that? Well, Shakespeare can, and one of his answers could be doing. Saying the right thing might be foolish in these days. Or, take old Lear, father and king. Can we really pity him, who is terrorizing his daughters and who eventually finds himself all by himself in a shattered world? And we as people of this age, who are mainly concerned with ourselves, it can't be difficult to find some parallels with Shakespeare's Richard III, who used to put himself in the center only, before he began to understand who he really had been. To sum it up, dear students, dealing with Shakespeare and his time is worth the effort. It poses a challenge to students' emotional and intellectual and imaginative skills. We, as students, learn to take different perspectives, and we can begin to understand how limited our own point of view sometimes is. Approaching Shakespeare means to begin to understand the strange in other people, the strange in ourselves, and what it means developing our own personality. Dear students, the Queen is dead, but Shakespeare is alive. Long live Charles III, and long live Shakespeare. Thank you very much for your attention.